Hi everybody, MJ Kinman here, and welcome back to my studio. This is month number 2 for our Diamonds and Drama Queens adventure. Last month we talked about Evelyn Walsh McLean and her fabulous McLean diamond. She owned a lot of other jewelry, and we'll be talking about those in future months. This month, however, we're going to be talking about a woman who is very different in temperament and style and the way she lived her life than Miss Evelyn did. Our diamond diva this month, her name is Huguette Clark. It's spelled Huguette, very French. Last name was Clark. Huguette was born in 1905 and she died in 2011, just a week shy of her 105th birthday. Now, what's interesting is that her father was born in 1839, was old enough to fight in the United States Civil War. And Huguette lived long enough to see the election of United States' first African-American president. Kind of mind-blowing to me, but that's 172 years. You can get that over 2 generations when you combine an older gentleman who marries a much younger woman, has children late in life. Those children live very, very long lives. And that's what happened. That's how Huguette Clark and her family has spanned these many, many decades. I want to mention the names of a couple of books that I read and learned about Huguette Clark. The first one is called Women of Means by Marlene Wagman Geller. It's filled with amazing stories of very, very wealthy women and their lives and their adventures. The other one about Huguette is specifically about Huguette is called Empty Mansions. Empty Mansions was written by Bill Dedman and Paul Clark Newell Jr., who was actually a descendant of one of W.A. Clark's older children. Now, what I'd like to do is talk a little bit about her family, because I think that might shed light on the kind of person she became and her interest in the future. Now, her father was named William A. Clark, otherwise known as W.A. W.A. he made his fortune in the copper mines out west. Now, why were the copper mines, like so many people went out there and took advantage of just pulling those natural resources out of the ground? Copper, lead, gold, silver, iron ore. Well, think about it. The industrial age was just getting ready to explode. America literally was moving west. Railroads were headed that way. The first transatlantic cable was laid in the mid-1850s. Then in 1856, Alexander Graham Bell invented the telephone. A few years later, Thomas Edison invented the incandescent light bulb. And about 1888, an inventor who was an inventor of ammunition basically invented something called the full metal jacket, which wrapped bullets in pure copper, which allowed people to kill each other from a longer distance than before, right? So these advances in commerce, in everyday life, and in warfare really drove demand for the elements that were out west in the mines, and they needed people to extract them, send them east so they could be produced into all of these new products. That's what William A. Clark did. However, he was more of an entrepreneur than just a copper mine. He came to copper mining a little bit later. He went out west during the Civil War. He was old enough to fight in the Civil War, but he didn't. He actually was out west in Colorado working as a prospector and working in different vocations that supported the mining industry. There was no shortage of opportunity for people who wanted to go out west and not necessarily be a miner or own a mine, but also to support the interests and the needs of the miners, kind of like Thomas Walsh did, Evelyn's dad. So there's a parallel there, right? So you know, what's interesting about W.A. is that he ended up becoming as wealthy as, say, Andrew Carnegie, Rockefeller with his Standard Oil, J.P. Morgan with his financing and his banking industry, Jay Gould and Vanderbilt with their shipping lines and their railroad lines. W.A. Clark was probably like the 3rd or the 4th richest man in America at that time. But you don't really hear about him like you hear about the Carnegie, Vanderbilts, Rockefellers, Goulds, et cetera. And I think there's a couple of reasons for that. One, he had a spectacularly corrupt political life. He was trying to get to become a senator in Montana. that really scandalized, made Montana the laughing stock of the country, and actually helped change the US Constitution because of his shenanigans, his misbehavior, his spectacular corruption. It led to the development of the 17th Amendment. We'll talk about that in a minute too. The other thing that might have led to the fact that his name was less known than Vanderbilt and Carnegie was that he didn't give away his money like these other two did. I know Andrew Carnegie, he felt that a man's life should be built into three sections. One is building a business. Second is growing it. Creating opportunities to make money, making all that money, and then giving it away. Well, WA never really got to that third stage of giving it away. So the first really big successful project that WA got involved was running mail. He was a mail carrier, and he ran mail from the headwaters of the Missoula River in western Montana through Idaho and into the Washington Territory. He did that, made a good amount of money. When it was time for him to find a wife, he subcontracted out that work, and he went east to marry an old friend, a young friend actually. Her name was Katie. Katie came back to them. They settled in Deer Lodge, where he became a grocery store owner and a banker. Right? When you can get the money to be a banker, man, you're pretty well set. Katie and WA had 7 children, 5 of whom survived into adulthood. During that time, WA bought abandoned mines, 4 abandoned mines. One of them included the United Verde mine down in near Jerome, Arizona. The United Verde mine became one of the richest and most productive and successful copper mines in the United States. WA also was very interested in life outside of Butte. A couple of things, where he touched history that I think you might find interesting. I find interesting because I'm a nerd, is that he was responsible for developing some of America's most famous cities. When he was in Butte, he knew he wanted to open up a railroad or a pathway to the West Coast so he could take his products out from ports on the West Coast to the Orient, to Asia. And so what he wanted to do was build a railroad. They called it the Clark Road, from the Butte, Montana, through the desert to the West Coast, where then they could sell their goods and put them on ships and get them out to the Orient. So he picked a sleepy little coastal town in California called Los Angeles and built that railroad to Los Angeles, thereby opening up trade and making it a lot faster to get to Los Angeles. The original route was going through Sacramento and then down, but it cut about 4 hours off. So the Clark Road was really instrumental in helping open up LA into a major city. He also realized that midway from his origination spot in Montana and LA, they were going to need a middle spot, some sort of a depot halfway and in the desert where they could pick up fuel, they could pick up water, they could store stuff, they could have the machinery worked on. And so he selected an abandoned Mormon missionary camp called Las Vegas. He bought 110 acres, subdivided it into about, I think, 1,000 or 1,200 lots, sold them, made $250,000, and Las Vegas was born. That's why the county that Las Vegas sits in is called Clark County. Let's talk about that scandal in the Senate. He had gained so much. He was a billionaire. He had businesses all around the United States. He was building his grand home in New York. We'll talk about that in a minute. But one thing that he wanted was a title, and he wanted to be called Senator Clark. So what he did, he got embroiled in just some really underhanded politicking. So here's what happened. At that time, before the 17th Amendment, the senators of the United States were chosen by the legislators, the state legislatures. After the 17th Amendment, the senators, US senators, are now elected by the people. And part of it is because of what happened with William A. Clark. So as William A. Clark was making his pitch and his bid to become a senator from the state of Montana, he had people go to the legislators and in front of them take an envelope and stuff it full of 10 $1,000 bills, seal it, have them write their initials on it and say, if you vote for WA, we will give this envelope to you regardless of whether he wins. So when he had their initials in their own handwriting. So really it was bribery and blackmail at the same time. Here's a little political cartoon of him throwing the money over the transom to the legislatures. It took multiple times for the legislatures to vote before WA, who started at the 18th position, finally got elected as senator. So he went to the Senate, and within days, the people of Montana were trying to get him out of his seat. So they launched a campaign, and actually the Senate Ethics Commission found him guilty on all charges, and then they had to release it to the full Senate to get him out of his seat, to unseat him. One thing that WA decided to do was to conspire with the lieutenant governor, who was a buddy. The governor of Montana wasn't necessarily a buddy. So they conspired to get the governor out of the state down to San Francisco to inspect some mines. Everybody in Montana was involved in mining in some way. So the governor was out of the state. The lieutenant governor was, he was in charge. Before the Senate could vote, WA resigned. He sent his letter to the honorable governor of Montana, not to the guy who was there, but to just a generic governor. The lieutenant governor at that point, once he received WA's letter of resignation from the Senate, realized he could appoint somebody to the Senate. And what did he do? He appointed WA to the seat he had just resigned from. That did not go over well at all, and it caused a huge scandal. Now, believe it or not, WA did run for a third time, or maybe it was more than that, and got elected. So he was a senator from Montana for one term. But during all of that, he turned Montana into a laughing stock and got the process going, and even added fuel to the fire for the 17th Amendment, which was to have the people of every state vote for the senators and not the legislatures. And the legislators, who were could be bribed with, packets of $10,000 packets of money. WA had one term as a senator and didn't run again. He decided to focus on building his beautiful castle in New York City. So WA is making all of this money. His wife passes away. She's 50 years old, and she passes away and he's in his early 50s, and his children are coming into their adulthood. The thing about WA is that he was kind of a lech. Young girls, 15, 16, 17 years old, caught his eye. And he acted as kind of a sugar daddy to some of these girls, sending them over to Europe to study music and singing and acting. And that's what he did. And he would go over to visit them. One of the people who attracted his eye at this point was a young woman named Anna LaChapelle. She was from Canada, the French-speaking part of Canada. And she was a musician. She loved to sing. She loved to play the harp. And so he, when she was 15 or 16, sent her to Europe to study the harp and study music. So this was probably in the late 1800s. About 1904, WA came back from a tour of Europe with Anna. And he announced that they'd been married. Not only had they been married, but they'd been married for a while, about 3 or 4 years, and they had a child. They had a 3-year-old daughter named Andrea. Andrea was WA and Anna's very first child, and Huguette's older sister. About 1905, Anna became pregnant again with Huguette. And during this time, Anna and her daughters and WA were traveling from Europe to Butte to then New York. WA decided he was going to move his family to New York and try to barge his way into what they called the 400 in New York. Now, the 400 was the term that had been unofficially given to high society that was really strongly controlled by Mrs. William or Carolyn Astor. Now, the interesting thing about the 400 was that Carolyn, who was such a snob, she said that basically the only people who could come into society in New York were people who were 3 generations away from the original creation of the wealth, and they had to be free from scandal. Well, W.A. failed on both of those accounts. First of all, he was the self-made millionaire, billionaire, and he had this terrible scandal in the Senate that forbid him from being part of it. So no matter how much money he threw at his attempt to try to get into society, he just couldn't make it. The interesting and ironic thing about it was that Carolyn Astor's husband, William Backhouse Astor, they basically led separate lives. He had a big yacht, and during the time that Mrs. Astor was holding court in society in New York, Mr. Astor was literally throwing sex parties for his friends and trafficking young girls on his yacht. So talk about the hypocrisy. You want to talk about hypocrisy of the Gilded Age, you just go read some Edith Wharton. She totally was very disillusioned with all that was going on there and the deep, deep hypocrisy and the snobbery that was going on in New York at that time. So one of the things that W.A. did was that to try to get the attention of society, sort of the doyens there, was to build one of the biggest, most expensive houses in New York City. Look at this thing. So W.A. selected a site in 1895, paying $220,000 for the northeast corner of Fifth Avenue and 77th Street. It was prominently situated in Millionaires Row. The New York World reported, when this modern palace is completed, it will rival in beauty and richness the mythical palace of Aladdin. It took him 16 years to build this thing. When it was finished, observers called it the biggest, bulliest, and brassiest of all American castles, the most remarkable dwelling in the world, and without doubt, the most costly and perhaps the most beautiful private residence in America. Guess how many rooms it had in it? 121 rooms in this house in New York City. This was Huguette's childhood home from the time she was 5 to 18. It's a fairy tale castle come to life with secret entrances, mysterious sources of music, and treasures collected from all over the world. When Andrea and Huguette would arrive home in their chauffeured automobile, accompanied by a private security guard, they passed through the open carriage gates, which were bronze gates 25 feet high, fit for a palace. Reporters who toured the home counted 26 bedrooms, 31 bathrooms, and 5 art galleries. W.A. often opened up his home to people so they could see his beautiful collection of European art. Below the basement's Turkish baths, swimming pool, and storage room for furs, a railroad spur brought in coal for the furnace, which burned 7 tons on a typical day, not only for heat, but also to power dynamos for the 2 elevators, the cold storage plant, the air filtration plant, and 4,200 light bulbs. He was using that copper that he helped mine out west, wasn't he? The cost of building Clark's house, not counting the furnishings, had been predicted to be about $3 million, which would have made it as expensive as Rockefeller's or Carnegie's homes. But as so often happens when home construction projects, the cost climbed to $5 million, then $7 million, and some newspapers said $10 million is what the final cost was. Do you know how much that would be in today's dollars? $250 million to build this house. So Huguette and Andrea were very, very close. They were pretty much kept apart from other children. They were highly protected. They had this huge house to run around in. Their mother was very artistic, very sensitive. She and her husband lived apart for most of the time because he was out on his travels out west. Oftentimes, though, they would go to France and vacation together, and those tended to be some of Huguette's favorite memories. One of the saddest moments in Huguette's life was when she was 13 and her sister Andrea was just a week shy of her 17th birthday. They went to a vacation in a place called Rangeley, Maine. One of our Diamond and Drama Queens members and I share a connection to Rangeley. Our shared family member lived there for many, many years in a little cabin in the woods up there. Sadly, Andrea, while there, contracted tubercular meningitis, which was an inflammation of her brain and spine, and she died. She died, and it absolutely devastated the family. I think that Andrea and Huguette were very different kids. Andrea was very outgoing, and even you can tell by this picture where Andrea is just kind of hanging off the arm of her father, while little Huguette stands there very straight as a rod, looking directly at the camera, no smile. But her sister is a very different style about her. When Huguette lost her sister, people say that she was adrift for a while. She and her mother became very close, and it was a sad time for the entire family. Not long after that, W.A. died. He was 86 when he died in March of 1925. As a result of the terms of the will, Anna and Huguette had to move out of that gigantic house after W.A. died because he had left it to his adult children. They found an apartment at 907 Fifth Avenue. They took the 12th floor of that, which was about 5,000 square feet. A little while later, they got the floor above that, and a little while later, they got another floor. So they ended up with about 15,000 square feet of living space at 907. So can you imagine having 15,000 square feet of living space in New York City? They basically were living on Fifth Avenue overlooking the sailboat pond in Central Park. Quite the digs. The reason they bought the number of apartments was that they knew that Anna would be living in one, and that Huguette needed to find a husband and live in another set of rooms in another floor. So she ended up being engaged to and marrying a guy by the name of William Gower, or Bill Gower. The marriage lasted 9 months. The story is that Huguette just didn't want what marriage brought. She wasn't interested in that at all. And some people said the marriage was unconsummated, and Huguette was just fine with that. So Bill went back to his mom, and Huguette was already living in 907, and so just kept that apartment. She and her mom lived in the same building, separate floors. There were other homes that they had purchased during this time. They also purchased a beautiful home on the Pacific coast near Santa Barbara called Bellesguardo. The name Bellesguardo means beautiful lookout, and it literally sits on a promontory out over above Santa Barbara, looking over the Pacific Ocean. It was originally an estate owned by Oklahoma oilman William Miller Graham and his wife Lee Eleanor Graham, who built the 25,000 square foot Italian villa in 1903. The next tenants were W.A. and his 17-year-old daughter, Huguette, along with Anna, her mother. Anna and Huguette would visit the family home, Bellesguardo, regularly from the mid-20s until about the early 50s. The Clarks' private Pullman rail car would park on a siding at the Santa Barbara train station, and their chauffeur, Walter Armstrong, would pick them up in a black 1933 Cadillac limousine or the gray-green 1927 Rolls-Royce, while the baggage would follow in a wood-paneled Plymouth station wagon. Now, during this time, Anna and Huguette did have small gatherings. Oftentimes, Anna would have, she loved chamber music, and so she would invite orchestra members to her home in New York and at Bellesguardo and invite people there. Oftentimes, Huguette was not to be seen. She was pretty much private and ended up being on her own quite a bit. One of the things that filled Huguette's time was painting. She took painting lessons and enjoyed that very much. She also took music lessons. She learned to play the violin. She owned two, not one, but two very expensive, very rare Stradivarius violins. And she was never without her beautiful dolls. She loved porcelain dolls. She loved collecting them. One of the things she loved doing most with those dolls was basically watching the fashions from Paris. The few times that she went out into society was when she'd go to the fashion shows and see the new creations that, for example, the couture Worth from Paris would be bringing. And so she would then talk to those folks and have those same fashions created, but on a much smaller scale, so she could wrap her dolls in that beautiful haute couture. Another thing that she loved was building miniatures. She built miniatures of homes for her dolls, and she loved Japanese dolls specifically, especially Japanese dolls that portrayed particular royalty. She knew from the way they dressed, the way they were positioned, what level of royalty they were in the Japanese culture. And she made sure that the people who created those miniatures for her, whether they were drawing rooms, whether they were traditional Japanese rooms, whether it was kabuki theater sets, that they were period perfect. And she would send them back if they weren't. Because she was an artist, she also loved illustration, particularly the illustration in a very popular magazine for young French girls that she bought an entire set of. One of her favorite illustrators was a gentleman by the name of LaRue. LaRue actually worked for Walt Disney, and Disney became LaRue's protege. I think LaRue actually worked on a little bit of the Mickey and Minnie series and invented Donald Duck. When Huguette was a little older in her life, she looked up LaRue and ended up commissioning a whole host of storybooks by him. She really became his patron. You know, I think that people often made fun of Huguette because she liked cartoons. But if you read through the material, she would actually not just watch cartoons, she actually had a DVD installed so she could watch these cartoons, the Smurfs and the Flintstones specifically, frame by frame by frame. She liked to see the movement and the development of of the lines and of the story. So it's not that she just liked cartoons, that she was simple-minded. She was looking at this literally as an art form. Again, also people said that she just liked to play with dolls, Barbie dolls and her porcelain dolls and her Japanese kabuki dolls. But again, think about this in terms of an expression of her art. She was looking at this as a way to bring about her love of fashion and illustration and history, and bring that to life in her own way through miniatures. There is actually this fabulous miniatures museum up in Maysville, Kentucky, here in Louisville. I've actually been to it, and they have many, many different gorgeous replicas of famous houses around the world. And people, it's big business. It is big business. You know, and again, you know, I often think about people who put her down saying, oh, she just liked cartoons and playing with dolls, when in fact her passions ran deeper than that. That's a surface view of it, but her passions ran deeper than that. And who of us is to judge her passions and her interests? I once had a woman, a family member of once say to me, why would you want to cut up perfectly good fabric and sew it together? And I had to think about that, going, you know, because I can't help myself. But it's true. We all have these passions that kind of on the outside look a little strange. I cut up fabric and put it back together into something that I created and I think is beautiful. And you do too. And what's really interesting about that woman is that when she mentioned that, she was standing right next to this gigantic carousel. It was a miniature, but it was huge, of a carousel, right? From like a circus or an amusement park, with all kinds of magical beasts around it. Her husband had created that beautiful carousel. It was actually a working model with the calliope. It turned, and the horses and the sea dragons and all that went up and down. And I'm like, okay, I cut up fabric. He cuts up perfectly good wood, but look what he makes. It's beautiful. There were a couple of other homes that Huguette and Anna had. One was Allegro Ranch, and another was a Connecticut home that Huguette purchased at the recommendation of an attorney, but was a home that she never lived in. It remained closed in Connecticut for nearly 50, maybe 60 years. After Huguette's mother, Anna, died, Huguette spent a lot of time by herself. Now, while she didn't go out much, I think one of her favorite phrases when people invited her to go someplace or to visit them was, I have a slight cold. She never went out, very rarely went out. But she did call people. She loved to talk to people on the phone. The interesting thing is she never gave them her number. She would always call them. They would always have to wait for a call from her. She also corresponded with people via postcards. She didn't like writing letters because it made her very nervous. She wasn't sure what she would say. But when you read her postcards, they are the most beautiful sentiments, short and sweet. So she was very much connected with the world, but on her own terms. So there was Huguette in her 907 Fifth Avenue apartment. She was probably in her 80s. She was living with all of these beautiful furnishings and jewels and her lovely dolls and her miniatures and her music. when she became ill, she had skin cancer, and it had really ravaged a bit of her face, some of her lips, some of her eye. She called a doctor who had since retired, who then called another doctor who went to visit her and found her literally almost a ghost. She was probably about 80 pounds at that time, very small, very slight, had her face wrapped in bandages, and they got her to the hospital. She recovered well, but you know what? She never left that hospital. She liked it there. She lived in a room that was about 15 by 27 feet. She was surrounded with her dolls. She had people to care for her. And that's where she decided to stay. Huguette was very, very generous. She would give somebody a small gift to the tune of $30,000. Her doctors found out about this and started taking advantage of her. There were a couple of doctors who would go in and start complaining about the fact that they had to send their kids to school or they had to put a new roof on their house. And Huguette would literally write a check out for $10,000 or $50,000 and hand it to the doc. Totally unethical, but that's what they did. They also started making plans to really try to get her to make a major gift to the hospital because it was undergoing very difficult times. Now, she lived there for the last 20 years of her life. She basically spent the equivalent of about $900 a day to stay there and to be cared for. Obviously, it was a huge revenue stream for the hospital, and not exactly the most ethical decision on the part of the administrators. How did they get away with that? When the regulators would come, well, they would move Huguette into another room and they would put a fake name on her door, Harriet Chase, rather than Huguette Clark. And they would not give the files, Huguette's files, to the regulators or the inspectors when they came to do their annual or however often that they would do their inspections. So you can see there was a number of things that kind of all combined together to help keep Huguette safe. Now the question is, was she really safe or not? Because she did seem to be taken advantage of a little bit by the people around her. Now, she did have some people that she very, very much trusted. Perry was her nurse for about 15 years and took very, very good care of her. She also had caretakers of her homes who did everything for her. She would have a question about something and they would go check on it. She wanted everything to be left exactly as it was when she lived there and nothing to be changed. In fact, in Bello Sguardo, there's a sign on the floor. There was a piece of paper on the floor that said, this is where a chair needs to go. It was moved 4 feet away for purposes of cleaning or something. But that piece of paper recorded where that chair had originally sat in that home. At Bello Sguardo, those 1933 and 1927 gigantic limousines were still in the garages at the time. Truly amazing. She just wanted things to be as they were. I think she was just pure of heart that way. She was very, she didn't like change, and she wanted her privacy. One of the sad things about that privacy, the price of that privacy, was when Citibank lost a whole safety deposit box of priceless jewelry. Can you imagine? Gems and jewelry. We have maybe 5 or 6 or 7 pieces, and I'm going to show them here, of the jewelry that she has. But an entire safety deposit box was either stolen or lost during her time at the hospital. When Citibank told Huguette that they would have to report the theft to Lloyd's of London, Huguette backed off because she did not want the publicity. In another case, there was a change of address issue where there was another safety deposit box filled with gems and jewels. And because of an address change in the administration of the bank, the notice for the payment of the safety deposit box was delayed and it went unpaid. And because it went unpaid, the bank decided it was abandoned and they drilled open the safety deposit box and they auctioned off the jewels for a fraction of what they cost. Given the fact that this is one of the gemstones, this is one of the gemstones, this fabulous bracelet is one of the pieces of jewelry that Huguette had. Can you even imagine the other jewelry that Huguette inherited from her beautiful mother, Anna, that W.A. had purchased for her over the decades? It just breaks my heart to think about that and where those pieces are now. Huguette died in 2011, just 1 week shy of her 105th birthday. Her life and her legacy were brought into perspective by a guy by the name of Bill Dedman. He was a Pulitzer Prize winning author. He was very, very interested in finding out about the Connecticut House and why it had been sitting empty for 50, 60 years. And so he started pulling threads, and the story of Huguette Clark and her family came to light. Actually was a series on NBC. I'm going to have to go look at that. But a couple of years ago, it was made into a news series about her life. I wish Huguette great peace and joy wherever she is now. Working with her dolls, building her miniatures, just painting to her heart's content, and finding joy in whatever she is doing now. And my hope is that she is with her beautiful sister, Andrea, her beautiful mother, and her beloved father, William A. Clark. Let's talk about the pattern. The pattern for the Clark Pink was inspired by that beautiful, vivid, fancy, purplish pink cushion cut gemstone, that beautiful diamond. You can see that I carved her up, and this is the point at which I start looking at a diamond not as necessarily a diamond, but then as a quilt block. This is the point at which I looked at this and I saw, you know what? I think I want to turn this into a 4-patch. This is a piece that we're going to put together with quadrants. So you can see the upper left, upper right, and lower left. Because they were quadrants, I was able to simply slice the 9-inch pattern down the center and put 1/2 on one page and 1/2 on the other page. You will print this out on freezer paper, and because that's a seam line, you don't have to do anything like we did with the last one, which is to actually assemble it with double-sided tape or washi tape for the 9 inches and the 12 inches. Because you're going to take this freezer paper and you're just going to go ahead and cut up this half, and you're going to cut up this half, right? There's, in this way that I sliced it right down a seam line. So there is nothing that you need to assemble, put back together before you recut it. If that makes sense. The last one, we actually had lines through vertical and horizontal that split facets in two. You had to reassemble that before then you cut out those facets. In this case, with the 9-inch, you don't need to do that. Just print out on freezer paper, page 2 and page 3, and then cut out those pieces with your rotary cutter and with the scissors. I like to use hand scissors for the curve. You can see for the 12-inch, I was able to break that up into 6-inch by 6-inch quadrants. So each one of those fits on a piece of paper. So you've got page 2, page 3, page 4, and page 5. So again, you don't have to reassemble these with any kind of double-sided tape or washi tape. Just print them out, cut them up, and there you have your facets that you're ready to iron onto your fabric. Now it's a little different for the 18-inch. The 18-inch, I couldn't just slice it into quads because that would be a 9-inch by 9-inch, which wouldn't fit on an 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper. So what I ended up doing was deciding, I think I want to slice up these quadrants, quadrant 1, 2, 3, and 4, with a vertical line that's a little bit set off to the outside edge of the pattern. Why did I do that? Because if you take that line and you slice it right down the middle, do you see how many lines it's going to, how many seam lines it's going to cut, how many facets it's going to cut through? It just seemed it would be easier if you only had a few facet lines to carve up rather than more. The other thing that this did is it allowed me to use less paper. So I was able to do slice it up into 8 pieces. The larger pieces went on 4, 2 of the smaller pieces went on 1, and the other 2 went on another. So instead of 8 pieces of freezer paper, you only have to print out 6. You can see on those small, thin areas, I have added the tab, and you put double-sided tape there, and then you overlay the other part, the larger part of that quadrant, over that double-sided tape, aligning the facet marks. You do that for each one of the 4 facets, and then you can cut up those quadrants. I'm working now with the 18-inch pattern. You can see that I have put together the 2 sections of each quadrant with my double-sided tape. Here I've got my double-sided tape, and you can see that I have overlaid the small piece with the larger piece with that double-sided tape on all 4 quadrants. Let's take a look now at section 4. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to take our highlighter and our ruler, and we're going to highlight the inside edges to identify that those are section edges that are probably prone to twisting and warping during the sewing process. We're not going to work, there's no need to highlight the outside edges of G, because we all will know that every G section, 418, 318, 218, 118, will be the outside edge. We will put those on the cross grain and the straight of grain. Now I'm going to take my hand scissors, and let's go ahead and cut the very first through line, which is the curve. I like to use my handheld scissors because I feel like I have more control than I do with my rotary cutter. You may feel a little differently, but I love working with my hand scissors. Okay, now let's take a look at the next through line. The next through line is this short little line on the inside corner, isn't it? It's the 17th facet. Let's go ahead and cut that off. We're going to set that aside. Now the next through lines are these long sort of columns that radiate from the center. So let's go ahead and cut those through lines. I'm going to change rulers here just so I have a little more control over my cut lines. I'm going to cut each one of them and setting that little, it almost looks like a Dresden plate fan, doesn't it? I'm going to set those aside. Now let's take the first section and let's go ahead and cut that section apart on those lines. Right, I'm just kind of moving through each one. Remember, precision is not a priority here. I'm going to show you in just a minute what I mean by that. I'm going to go ahead and set these aside, basically sorting them by color code. You can see I'm putting them above the edge of the screen by color code, which is the letter code, isn't it? All right, let's go ahead and keep going. I'm going to change rulers here because I like my little shorter ruler for these tinier pieces. Okay, now look, I have actually cut off of the line a little bit. It's hard to see because it's a little out of focus, but I have cut a little proud of that line. It's okay because I can actually see the hash marks on both sides. So I'm not going to worry about it. I'm going to keep on cutting. All right, now that I've got my pieces cut, I'm going to start sorting them by color code. It's the letter code on each one of the facets. The same section, we just did section 4, but now we're going to go ahead and sort them by color code. Let's take our envelopes. I've listed the alphabet on each one of them and on the back. We will insert each one of our little groups of color code facets in each envelope. Now you might use plastic baggies. I just like using envelopes because 1, I have a ton of them laying around, and 2, I just think there's enough plastic laying around in the ocean. So I like to use my little envelopes, and I reuse them over and over again. Now, when it comes to big pieces like G, the background piece, you can go ahead and just fold that up and tuck that in. It doesn't matter. You're going to hit these with a hot iron once they're on the fabric anyway, so don't even worry about the little crease lines. Just shove that little thing in there, set it aside. Now we're ready to begin looking at our fabric and identifying our fabric swatches to the color codes. I'm going to make my color chart, listing out each one of the letters of the colors. Then I'm going to pull a lot of my fabric out and really begin identifying which values. I'm using this beautiful fabric that Jennifer Sampu has put together. They're gradients. This is a gradient called Sky, and this is the Sundance one. Oh, what I just put up here now is called Opal. You can see I've cut into it a little bit, but this is a lovely piece. So you can see I've got a wide range of values. It's Sky by Jennifer Sampu. So I'm going to take a little piece of each one of these and put them on my color chart on top of the double-sided tape. This is one of my favorite ways of putting together my color charts. Little sections of double-sided tape, and then I can go ahead and put my little snippets of color on that color chart. I'll know which color belongs to which letter without any doubt at all. And now I'm going to work on the E color code. This is the darker color code. I like this kind of dark and moody, saturated magenta here. So I'm going to pull my envelope of E out. Let's go ahead and make sure there's nothing inside. All right, I know what my straight of grain looks like. That's my straight of grain up top there. You can see it's the darker gradient. So my straight of grain is going across my fabric. You can see here's the longest edge of 4-4, which is one of my E pieces. And I'm going to lay that right here along the straight of grain close to the edge, leaving a good 1/2 inch, maybe 3/4 inch available. Again, here's another one. I'm going to go ahead and position that long edge, a kind of hypotenuse of the triangle along the straight of grain. And I'm just going to keep doing that, placing it along and on fabric that I really want to highlight in my gemstones. Some of this fabric has beautiful blends of magenta and a little purple. And I really try to grab those so that I can, show some wonderful flow of light and color. Plus, let's make sure that we leave a nice 1/2 inch between each one. I'm going to cut it out again so it's easier to cut with my rotary cutter. Let's take a look at how we're going to do the corner edges, the 18th facet of each one of your quadrants. I'm going to identify my straight of grain. And here is my corner. That's the edge of the quadrant. That's the outside edge of the block, isn't it? So I want to be sure that aligns with the straight of grain and the cross grain. We're going to cut it out. Now we're ready to cut out our fabric. I've made them very manageable pieces. I'm going to take my rotary cutter that I use for fabric and my ruler, my OmniGrip ruler that has the 1/4 inch shaded edges, which makes it really nice to look at and to be able to see the 1/4 inch on both light and dark fabrics. That's why I love this little ruler. So let's go ahead and start slicing it up. Every single edge of your triangles, your little quadrilaterals need to be cut out at a 1/4 inch. Try to make it as consistent as possible because this is going to make assembly so much easier for you. Now, do you see how this little guy, maybe it's hard to see, but 4-7, I've kind of cut, again, proud of that dark line. It's a little bit to the right-hand side. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to align my ruler, not on the line, but on the edge of the paper, right? Edge of the paper. So let's go ahead and cut to the edge of the paper and continue slicing up that fabric around 4-7. Same thing, going to be as careful as possible to line up that 1/4 inch as close to that edge of the paper as possible, not the line if you cut proud, but the edge of the paper. Now I'm going to renumber my envelopes to be my section numbers, right? We're going to take those color codes, cross them out and put our section numbers out here. And the quadrant we're working on now is quadrant 4. So we're going to put all of these pieces we're about ready to cut out in this envelope for section 4. All right, let's talk about doing curves. This is a gentle curve. What I'm going to do now is take my rotary cutter, my fabric rotary cutter, and my ruler. I'm going to place the edge of my 1/4 inch measurement on the edge of the fabric. I'm going to place my rotary cutter opposite that. And as I rock and roll that ruler down, I'm going to also pull down my rotary cutter so that it is opposite the edge of the fabric. Let's try it again. So every time I rock that ruler, I'm going to draw down my rotary cutter at the same time so that rotary blade is hitting the exact opposite edge from the paper. Here we go, rolling it down, and it's opposite. I'm going to roll it down, rock it, roll it, rock it, roll it. There you go, 1/4 inch. Sometimes it really works better if you work faster. Let's go ahead and cut out the rest of these pieces. Let's now take a look at that 18th piece. Here's 418. If you feel more comfortable doing this long, gentle curve, this nice convex curve with either a chalk pencil or an erasable pen, feel free to do that. Obviously, because it's a white fabric, I'm going to use an erasable pen in blue. So I'm going to do the same concept, the same technique that I used with my rotary cutter. I'm going to place my ruler at the edge, and as I rock and roll my ruler along the edge of that curve, I'm going to draw down my eraser pen little bit by little bit. I'm going to take it slow and easy. Here we go. I'm going to move it a little bit, kind of draw it down as I rock my ruler. And there's my curve. So I can either take my scissors, and in this case, I would go ahead and just slowly cut along that lovely line. And of course, if you'd rather use your rotary cutter and your ruler, again, just as you're rocking and rolling your ruler, draw down your rotary cutter so it's exactly opposite the point at which your ruler, your 1/4 inch measurement, is sitting on that paper of the facet. Again, I'm rocking, I'm rolling, rocking and rolling. It's okay to stop and adjust your ruler. It's okay to stop and adjust the entire piece. Just breathe, relax, and keep cutting. Try to make that as an exact 1/4 inch measurement as you possibly can. It's always, curves are not easy, but they're nothing to fear. Just work at it, practice, and you'll get it. There's a little extra piece here that I think I want to trim up a little bit. Okay, now it's time to go ahead and trim up the other edges of our 18th facet. The next step in the process is to organize all of your facets in that quadrant by numerical order, just to make sure that you have all of them. So you can see here, I have them in numerical order: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, and 18. They're all here. I'm good to go. Now it's time to put them together in my piece plan according to my cheat sheet that I have printed out on regular paper. So you can see here is 418, and here's 1 through 4, 5 through 8, 9 through 12, 13 through 16, 17, and 18. I'm going to use that now as my guide to put the puzzle together. So here we go. I'm putting together 1, 2, 3, and 4. That's the first fan in my diamond. 5, 6, 7, 8 is my second. You see how I'm putting them, kind of scooching them together so I can use them as a unit with space in between, daylight in between. So it's another great visual clue for when I need to go grab those pieces. I'm ready to assemble.